Welcome to this chess video, everyone. So here I have actually 3 examples of some common yet bad chess advice. And so these are things that you definitely want to avoid. Now, these are also kind of paradoxical, so we'll actually get into it and we'll see why exactly these pieces of advice seem good but actually could become harmful. So the first one is opening principles. Everyone loves how important this is, right? It's a great thing for beginners. Many people use it all the time. And to be fair, it is really foundational to chess. So opening principles is a really good piece of advice normally. Now, where this can be a problem is when people who are more intermediate to advanced range, especially, keep following opening principles too blindly. So let me give a good example of that. So let's just play the Caro-Kann. So of course that would be e4 and then c6. d4 is very common, and then of course d5. And this is kind of the start of the Caro-Kann. Now, one of the most popular moves here is pawn to e5. So, okay, sure, this is the advanced variation. If you play the Caro-Kann, most people have probably seen this many times. The old main line here is bishop to f5, and everything is fine so far. Now, what do we do if, let's say, the opponent plays pawn to h4, which this is an actual variation, no, it's a Tal variation. If you've studied opening theory, then you know that this is one of the main lines they can choose, even if it's not the most popular. But let's assume that this is your first time seeing this, and you've never seen this opening before. Well, should you fall back on opening principles? Now, opening principles can help you avoid many traps, and so as a beginner, this is a really useful skill, because maybe 95% of the time, you're probably going to avoid most problems if you just follow opening principles. But the problem is, when you're lower rate especially, you don't know all that theory, and so you just have the principles to fall back on. As a more advanced player, if you're never looking for those maybe unique cases, those exceptions to the guideline, then you're never going to find those possibilities. So like here, for example, if I were to just try and develop normally, what would I play? Well, maybe a move like e6 would come to mind, and then I can try and develop my dark squared bishop and hopefully bring out my knight on g8, maybe try and get castled. So that's a pretty common looking idea, facilitate development of this piece. Now, of course, people who do know opening theory will know, well, this is a common book trap. So if you play e6, this is actually a big mistake here, because now white actually has pawn to g4. And after pawn g4, you're going to move your bishop somewhere like e4. And then, unfortunately, comes f3, and they're pushing a lot of pawns, but you're probably noticing that your bishop is actually trapped. It's going to have to come back to g6, and then h5, and black is actually losing material because they were trying to get developed. So unfortunately, that doesn't really help them. Now, let's go back to that e6 move, right? What if they try and develop a piece instead? I mean, knight d7 looks like one of their pieces they could try and develop, but they fall into the same problem. Pawn to g4, their bishop, this time, if they don't want to get the same trap, has to retreat back to e6. And this just looks really sad. The fact that this bishop is blocking their own pawn, sitting behind this pawn, it's really not the ideal setup you want. And after white plays, pawn to f4, already white is, much, I'd say, favored, even though they've advanced a ton of pawns by their king. This black bishop is just not so good, and black's development is really terrible here. So, with that being said, this is a really good example of why maybe following these opening principles in this case doesn't actually work. So, what should they do instead? Well, if you know theory, of course, then it's really easy. But if you don't, you have to come up with something else. And this is a creative moment where you have to think, well, I see their threat now. What can I do to stop this? And this bishop needs an escape square. And it would be really nice if the bishop could actually drop back to h7. And so you're really forced between kind of these two options, either h6 or h5. And both of these are opening theory. h5, I believe, is the better move, and that's also more popular. So, with that being said, the move would be h5, and the game continues. But you would never be able to even consider a move like h5 if you were following opening principles too blindly. And so, that's something to keep in mind that, it's good advice if it's followed loosely, but you shouldn't be following opening principles exactly to the letter, or it can actually get you into some trouble if you just think you're always going to get a great position with it. It might be a good position with opening principles, but it's not necessarily the best position. And as you become more advanced, you probably want to start pushing for what's the best move in the position, even if it looks a bit unnatural to the untrained eye. So let's bring up the second example here. So the second example is actually very common advice that people say, just trade, simplify things. A lot of beginners, whether they're taught this consciously or subconsciously in their mind, they kind of have this idea that if they can trade pieces, they're going to simplify the position and make it easier. And so a lot of beginners, when the game starts, they'll try and trade off their queen for their opponent's queen. in their mind, that gives them better drawing chances, or maybe it can simplify the position. But unfortunately, that doesn't really work in chess because the remaining pieces they have, they're going to use against you, and all you've done is traded off pieces unnecessarily. So in this position, we're not actually going to go over it because I actually did an entire video on this example on why you should not be trading pieces. I'll go real briefly, just a few moves, just kind of give you a taste of it. But you should probably check out that video, and we'll go much more in depth on why trading is actually a bad problem. Because that actually held me back for many years, I'd say, at least a year. I thought I'm up a pawn, I'll trade, they take back, and I thought I'm great. So I try and trade again. So I go bishop to e5 check. And so they move their king, that's fine. I want to trade bishops, right? So I trade, they take back, and then, well, I keep wanting to trade. So how can I force even more trades? And so knight to f5 I thought was great because, now this knight is probably going to be traded. They probably don't want to move their queen. And unfortunately, you can kind of sense the pattern here that when they take and I take back, I've already given up a huge part of my advantage. And so make sure to check out that video on why. And I actually kept losing the advantage for the rest of this game and ended up losing. Some bad advice is to just trade pieces. I hear a lot of times people just say that. Really bad advice. Make sure to try and avoid that. And try and think very clearly, if a trade is actually helping you or not, and look at the pros and cons of it. Don't just trade just because you think it'll make it simpler. Okay, so now here's the last example, which I have here, which kind of goes to my next advice. And this one is probably the most surprising in the entire video. So there's a very common bit of advice that so many people, especially chess coaches, say, and that's solve many chess tactics, do many chess puzzles, just keep solving. And unfortunately, I think that's actually really bad advice. Now, it's good in the sense that puzzles are very important because they help with pattern recognition. And if you have a really good tactical ability, you can probably catch your opponent, who doesn't know too much, into a lot of mistakes and start exploiting them. And that sounds great. Now, what's the problem to this? The problem with this is I think that's just a lazy way that a lot of chess coaches just try and, have their students improve, but don't want to really give them that tailored training that's a lot tougher to actually come up with. So the reason this is a problem is, as you can probably suspect, chess is way more than tactics, right? Chess has the opening, chess has middle game, chess has, all these end game ideas. There's way more than just tactics. And a good example is positional chess. Like here, in this position is from a student from International Master Jeremy Silman, and this is actually in his book, How to Reassess Your Chess, this 4th edition. And so in this position here, his student played rook f to e1, contesting the open file. His opponent also tried to support that file with rook f to e8. And so now we're kind of at a critical juncture where what is the best move? And let's start looking for tactics, right? If you've solved many chess puzzles, all these tactics over and over and over, you're trained, where's the tactic? And there aren't any. And that's the problem. Because in a real game, you have to set up tactics. They don't just pop into the air out of nowhere. It was, Bobby Fischer who famously said that tactics flow from a superior position. And so you actually have to get a superior position for tactics to appear. And a position like this, we have some advantage, but there's no tactics because it's a fairly closed position. There's only one open file, and we're going to have to use positional chess to continue the game. And so, obviously there's going to be some battle over this open file here, but what is the exact best move? And so if you're just solving tactics, you're not going to find this move because it's a positional idea. So in Jeremy Silman's book, he actually gives this next move a double exclamation point. I think just one is probably better, but the move is rook to e6. This is actually the best move according to the engine. So that's a really nice idea, but it's a positional sacrifice, right? Like they can literally just take our rook with the bishop and they can win material. And so would you have found that if you were looking for tactics? No, but if you're looking at positional chess, then absolutely you might find this move. And so what do we get for this, right? Because we don't just want to throw away material. And so let's actually kind of examine the position. Before this, we had a equal-ish looking battle, and we both had equal material. But if we put our rook on e6, now we're actually threatening to double rooks. Okay, that sounds logical so far. But what else happens? Like, mainly, what if they take our rook, right? So if they take here, and we take back with the d-pawn, what exactly have we got here? Well, black is up the exchange. Yes, they're up by 2 points of material now, so that's good to their benefit. Okay, but what about everything else? Because material is not everything. Well, let's look at piece activity. How are all the pieces doing? I think it's pretty clear that all of white's pieces are probably better than black's, and especially their minor pieces are really cramped, kind of comical looking. White's minor pieces are actually really active, and especially this bishop attacking this pawn that's actually pretty weak. Now, you might also notice that in some lines, this f6 pawn is actually kind of vulnerable. Maybe a move like knight to d5 might actually start exploiting this and forking the queen in the process. And so we're getting a lot of good things just because of this one trade. The opponent is really cramped, and we have all of the play here. And I'd say white is much better. But you wouldn't have been able to set up this position, which, is kind of leading way to more tactics as we're noticing. For example, like this move, if they're not careful, that already wins back some material. But how do we set all this up? This came up from a positional idea, that rook to e6 move. And how would you have found rook to e6 if you're only looking for tactics? So, a lot of people say, just solve tactics, just solve puzzles. And I think that's a bit lazy because, there's so much more to chess than just solving puzzles. So it absolutely can help. And if you're going to do one thing for your chess, doing a lot of puzzles is probably a pretty good thing to have. But this actually becomes really bad advice when you just blindly do puzzles. You're pretty much only doing puzzles. You have to be looking at positional chess and openings and endgames and all the other elements that make up the entire game. That way your game is a bit more balanced and you can help set up those tactics. Because those tactics are quite useless if there are literally none in a positional, situation, or the game state is just such a closed formation that there's just no tactics available. So those are some ideas to kind of help you with your chess. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next chess video.